Jai Hind everyone. It's matter of great honor for Center for Joint Warfare Studies, CENJOWS, to have Commodore A. Singh amongst us, who is very widely known in the entire circle of the Defense Forces, academia, and the whole country really speaking. But today he will be speaking to us on an interesting subject, and that subject is something related to the country in general and our maritime aspirations in particular. Chief of Defense Staff has been speaking to a number of forums where he has highlighted that time has now come when we are moving towards jointness, integration, and theaterization. The country is not to be seen as a continental country with large oceanic borders. It's time that we start seeing this as a great island nation with some land borders. This shift in approach is justified because historically, as and when we accorded that kind of importance to our oceanic power, Chola regime being one of them, the growth and expanse of country was far too wide. Subsequently, also when we were subjugated by Western countries, it was also through them who had the substantial oceanic power, whether they were Portuguese, Dutch, or the Britishers. Anyway, all that thing is a matter of past. Today we shall look at if we have this kind of changed approach towards looking at our country. So what kind of aspirational change have to be brought in the maritime domain in terms of their policies, doctrines, interfaces with other sister services, entire outlook to the regional challenges and international challenges. You would have seen how beautifully Navy has done an exceptional job in the Red Sea, of course in concert with the Air Force, and many more such activities will be emerging, and that kind of challenge will be forthcoming. These challenges will happen both during peace as well as during war, and therefore earlier we prepare, better it is going to be for us. So this is adequate just to give you backdrop of the subject on which we are going to hear our revered speaker. Now hand you over to Captain Nitin from Indian Navy, who shall be introducing the speaker before you get the privilege of hearing the speaker.
Commodore Anil Singh is an alumnus of the National Defence Academy, the Defence Services Staff College, and the Naval War College. His 3-decade-long career as a submariner includes the command of 4 submarines and a fleet ship. A specialist is in anti-submarine warfare from the erstwhile Soviet Union. He was also the commissioning ASWO for 2 Kilo-class submarines. On shore, he has served at naval headquarters in the Directorates of Naval Plans and Submarine Acquisition, and has done instructional tenures at the Submarine Warfare College, Warfare School, the National Defence Academy, and the Naval War College. He was the Defence and Naval Advisor at the Indian High Commission in the United Kingdom from 2006 to 2009, after which he served as the Deputy Assistant Chief in the Maritime Section in the Perspective Planning Branch of the Integrated Defence Staff before taking premature retirement in 2011. Postgraduate in Defence and Strategic Studies, he takes keen interest in matters maritime and is frequently invited to speak and write on the subject in India and abroad both. He has been a regular speaker at think tanks and professional maritime conferences in India and abroad, and has participated in various Track 1.5 initiatives related to security issues in the Indo-Pacific region. He's a regular peer reviewer for various professional journals and has contributed chapters on maritime issues for numerous books. He also writes regularly for the mainstream media and web portals on procurement issues, indigenization, maritime strategy, and undersea domain and the Indo-Pacific. Some other hats which he wears include an honorary adjunct fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, senior vice president of a leading European MNC in India, the vice president of the Indian Maritime Foundation, which is India's leading NGO in the maritime domain, the vice president of the Navy Foundation's Delhi chapter, a member of the governing body of the Society for Indian Ocean Studies, and a member of the Defense Audit Advisory Board. He was the former co-chair of the Defense and Aerospace Committee of ASSOCHAM. I invite Commodore Retd Singh for the talk.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm indeed honored to be here at CENJOWS, and I'm very grateful to the DG for giving this opportunity to speak to you on a subject of great topical relevance. And Nitin, thank you for this kind and long introduction. I've been a life member of CENJOWS since 2010, when I joined the headquarter IDS as the Deputy Assistant Chief Maritime in the Perspective Planning Branch. And it gives me great pleasure to see CENJOWS having grown from its very humble beginnings at that time in a porter cabin in Kashmir House to its present status as one of the leading defense think tanks in the country. And I can see it going from strength to strength with every passing day, and feel indeed proud to be part of this fine think tank. CENJOWS, I think, has a very important role to play in shaping the contours of the evolving defense architecture in the country. The DG alluded to the CDS having mentioned the importance of jointness and theaterization. I agree with that. He alluded to jointness just a couple of days ago at an event. And within jointness, I think theaterization constitutes its most important component. So getting down to what the subject of my talk, in the current Indian context, theaterization generally refers to the continuing debate on the reorganization of our single service-oriented commands into integrated theater commands, while simultaneously promoting jointness through integrated training, logistics, and other support functions. This reorganization, which began after the institution of the Chief of Defence Staff in 2019, is still a work in progress, and its implementation is being thought through very carefully. Initially, there was a feeling that it will be pushed through, but fortunately, that hasn't happened, and it is being thought through carefully. Various committees have been formed which have brainstormed this issue. Senior veterans have been consulted regularly, and there has been a lot of internal debate and discussion on this subject. Any change of this magnitude needs to address all possible macro and micro loose ends that might follow. There is no doubt that some will remain, but I'm sure these will get resolved by and by. However, in India's case, it is very important that these are as few as possible because of the live threat that we are facing from our largest two neighbors. Both are adversarial towards us, both are nuclear armed, both have an unholy nexus between them, and both are constantly sniping at India's heels. They will be closely observing this reorganization and will be looking to exploit any perceived vulnerability that may arise during this transition. The concept of theater commands was initiated by the United States, who began this process as early as 1949 and gave it the final seal of approval with the passing of the Goldwater-Nichols Act in 1986. This theaterized construct has thereafter been followed by many militaries, including the UK and most recently Turkey and China. While the basic template remains the US model, each country has adapted the model bespoke to its own requirements, including ours, where even today, as has happened in all these countries, the relevance of theaterization is still being debated. As recently as last week, I was in a closed-door discussion where a very senior naval veteran was of the opinion that India as a whole is a theater, and the existing command structure, at least in the maritime domain, addresses this with decisions being made at the apex level in Delhi. So why are we introducing another cog into the chain of command with a maritime theater commander? Jointness, in his view, it was a different thing altogether from theaterization and should not be confused with it. But that is an opinion which has been expressed. Many people have many opinions on this subject. There is of course no argument that in the current resource deficient scenario, wherein economies are constrained and military expenditure is being questioned at every step, the optimization of available resources will require militaries across the world to tighten their belts and ensure that they get the maximum bang for the buck. So while jointness is largely accepted as the way ahead, the argument is whether in the Indian context, theaterization is an operational necessity or not. The reason I have highlighted this is not to dispute the concept of theaterization, which to my mind is a fait accompli, but more to highlight the difficulties that will lie in its implementation and in overcoming the well-entrenched single service mindsets and single service hierarchies. I will come to this later when discussing the modalities of the Maritime Theatre Command. Coming to the subject of India's maritime aspirations in a theaterized environment, and keeping in mind the constraints of time that we have, I will restrict myself to highlighting just three major aspects. I will be a bit provocative with the intention of generating an interesting Q&A at the end of the session. The three issues that I will highlight are, firstly, what is understood or what constitutes a maritime theatre? What are India's maritime security imperatives and its maritime aspirations? And thirdly, does the proposed Maritime Theatre Command address these? An operational theatre, as conventionally understood, has very clearly defined geographical limits because land borders are clearly demarcated, and transgressing these either on land or in the air is inviolate. It is therefore important to understand that unlike land borders, the oceans are all interconnected and there are no distinct international borders dividing them. In fact, the well-known cliche goes that land borders divide, whereas the oceans unite. Even in the 12-mile limit of a nation's territorial waters, warships and submarines of other countries can take what is known as innocent passage. The neutrality of the high seas has been enshrined in the principle of mare liberum, enunciated by the Dutch lawyer Hugo Grotius in 1602. This has since then underpinned every legislation pertaining to the governance of the oceans, including the current United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, which is widely regarded as the Constitution of the Oceans. That is why the high seas are also referred to as the global commons, and it is this principle of the high seas being equal for one and all that has allowed global trade to flourish over the centuries and enabled global connectivity through trade and maritime diplomacy. Oliver Cromwell many years ago had said that a man of war is his best ambassador. In fact, the first attempt at regulating the high seas has been the recent treaty called the Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, also referred to more commonly by its acronym BBNJ, which was passed in June 2023. It has been promulgated primarily not to restrict access to the high seas, but to protect the sensitive marine ecosystem from activities that are causing depredation and degradation to an environment that is already under strain from the effects of climate change. Anyway, returning to the core subject of my talk, the limits of a maritime theatre are therefore not demarcated by maritime boundaries, but are primarily decided by a navy's capability and capacity, or a nation's capability and capacity to effectively secure its national interests in the maritime domain. It is also not limited by sovereign borders, unlike land borders or sovereign airspace, and often overlaps. For example, if you take the US Indo-Pacific Command, it extends from the Western Pacific to the west coast of India, and the US Central Command operational area beginning from there and extending up to the Western Indian Ocean. However, both of these do not in any way impinge either upon the maritime extent of the Chinese Maritime Theatre in the Western Pacific or the proposed Indian Maritime Theatre Command in the Indian context. India, on its part, depending on its maritime and military capabilities and capacity, has to decide its own geographical extent of its Maritime Theatre Command. Coming to the second part of my talk on India's strategic maritime imperatives. India, as the DG mentioned, is essentially a maritime nation. If one were to look at an inverted map of the Indian Ocean, three things stand out. So if you look at this inverted map of the Indian Ocean, you realize, and you look at India and its peninsula, three things stand out. Firstly, the expanse of the sea space flanking peninsular India on three sides. It's huge. Secondly, and more significantly, India's vantage location practically in its center. And thirdly, the presence of strategically significant choke points on both its eastern seaboard and its western seaboard, which are a unique feature of the Indian Ocean. In the last 2 decades or so, there has been a distinct shift in the global geopolitical and geoeconomic center of gravity to the Indo-Pacific. More than 60% of the global population is resident here, and it generates 2/3 of the global GDP. Hence, this region is critical for the well-being of the global economy and has therefore led to nations as far as Canada and as Eurocentric as Germany and the Netherlands to articulate their own Indo-Pacific strategies, which are basically focused on the safety of their trade and their economic interests. None of these countries have the military capacity at present to make a difference in this region, but will be counting upon like-minded countries like India and other maritime democracies to provide a secure, rules-based order at sea. I could go on speaking about the importance of this ocean, but I will briefly touch upon three aspects again, which are significant from India's perspective. First, as I said, India is essentially a maritime nation. Its economic well-being is totally dependent upon the sea. More than 90% of its trade and over 80% of its energy requirements travel over the sea. As India grows to a 5 trillion economy and then a 10 trillion economy and an ambitious 30 trillion economy by 2047, the volume of its sea trade, seaboard trade, and its energy flowing over the sea will increase exponentially. And so will the importance of ensuring its safe and secure passage across the oceans. India is spreading its wings across the oceans from Sakhalin to South America, all of which will need to be protected. India has a coastline of 7,516 kilometers with 12 major ports and over 200 non-major ports. The government's thrust on improving India's maritime connectivity through programs like Sagarmala further increases the importance of our coastal areas. We are blessed with a resource-rich 2.3 million square kilometers of exclusive economic zone. As the world turns increasingly towards the oceans for its future sustenance, this EEZ will be one of the challenges. will become a more special resort, but also will be a challenge because other powers, other inimical extra-regional powers will also seek to impinge upon this space. We have to ensure that we don't allow any such inimical interest to mess around in our waters. India's maritime assets will also underpin the country's blue economy initiatives to ensure the country's sustainable development. More than 250 million Indians live within 50 kilometers from the sea. The effects of climate change with rising sea levels and ocean warming are going to impact their lives and livelihoods. Besides, they are living under the constant threat of extreme weather events, which are going to increase in frequency and intensity. This is a serious national security challenge which needs to be addressed. The second important maritime security challenge is going to be the rise of China. India's preeminence as the leading naval power in the Indian Ocean has never been challenged. It is not a coincidence that despite the tense four-year standoff that we have had along the LAC, China has steered clear of the Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean. This is because China is well aware of the lack of its capability to take on the Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean. However, this could well change over the next decade or so. In the last 4 decades, China has transformed itself from a continental power into the world's leading maritime power and is well on its way to becoming a formidable naval power. It has a Mahanian approach. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahar spoke about sea power being the key to global dominance. But China is following that approach to global supremacy via the sea. China's biggest limitation is that it is severely constrained by its maritime geography. And while it may be able to dominate the Western Pacific, if it has to achieve its stated aim of maritime dominance, it needs two things. First, it needs adequate sea space to flex its maritime muscle, which its own maritime geography does not permit. And second, it needs access to the Atlantic Ocean, which also its maritime geography does not permit. However, the Indian Ocean offers it both. Hence, while Taiwan and China and the South China Sea will remain China-US flashpoints in the near future, the actual great power contestation will take place in the Indian Ocean. India, as a major player in the Indian Ocean, will have to develop both the capacities and the capabilities to influence the outcomes in this region at that time and not allow itself to get influenced by them. China is slowly and surely expanding its footprint westwards into the Indian Ocean through its deft economic and military diplomacy and through strategic programs like the Belt and Road Initiative and export of military hardware to friendly countries in the Indian Ocean littoral. The PLA Navy is growing at an astonishing pace, and by the end of this decade, will probably have over 450 ships, including 4 to 5 aircraft carriers. It is already the largest navy in the world with over 350 ships, but it still lacks the blue water power projection capability, which it endeavors to get by 2030. Of these, at least one carrier battle group, of these 4 or 5 aircraft carriers, at least one carrier battle group will be permanently deployed at any given time in the Indian Ocean. Its base at Djibouti is being extended to accommodate aircraft carriers. It is also rapidly growing its blue water capability with the Type 055 destroyers, the Type 075 expeditionary ships, and the Type 095 nuclear attack submarines. By 2030, it is expected to have at least 20 SSNs. A permanent deployment of 2 to 3 SSNs in the Indian Ocean, operating in conjunction with a blue water capable carrier battle group and a formidable expeditionary capability, will certainly put pressure on the Indian Navy's existing favorable maritime situation in the Indian Ocean. China is also arming Pakistan with 8 air-independent propulsion-equipped Type 039 submarines, which are obviously going to be used to restrict Indian fleet movement in the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. Similarly, the submarine base built by China in Bangladesh, commissioned as the BNS Sheikh Hasina in March 2023, will be in a position to support Chinese submarine deployments in the Bay of Bengal, which till now was virtually an Indian lake. Also, it won't come as a surprise if China shifts one of its theater commands into the Indian Ocean when it seeks access to the Atlantic in much the same way that the Americans do. China has carefully studied the US model and is structuring its navy accordingly to project power in what it calls its far abroad, which at the moment reads the Indian Ocean. Coming to my third point, as the leading Indian Ocean power, India takes its responsibility of ensuring a rules-based order very seriously. In the last 3 months, the Indian Navy has been at the forefront in tackling Somali piracy, which the DG referred to, with great success, and has greatly enhanced its already sound credentials as a preferred security partner and a first responder in any crisis. The multi-mission deployment of its ships ensures that it can respond with alacrity to any developing situation in the region while ensuring a robust maritime domain awareness capability. It has been at the forefront in providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, or HADR as it is better known, which is becoming an increasingly important role for contemporary navies. The Indian Navy is structured as a balanced, multi-dimensional blue water force and focuses on a capability-based approach rather than a threat-based approach. It has become an important instrument of India's increasingly proactive foreign policy, and Indian naval ships are now operating across the 7 seas. This brings me to the third part of my talk. Does the theaterized environment address India's maritime aspirations? To that, my short answer is a resounding yes, as would be evident from what I have said so far. As I said in the beginning, theaterization will not be without its challenges, and the skeptics will find many holes to pick. However, since it is, as I mentioned, a fait accompli, it is best to see how can it be implemented to fulfill its mandate of enhancing national security. In 2001, based on the Kargil Committee report, a group of ministers led by the then Deputy Prime Minister Sri Lalkrishna Advani had recommended the creation of a Chief of Defence Staff and a future joint warfighting capability. It was expected that this would happen soon, but did not. There were lots of false alarms. I was in the Director of Naval Plans. We had reached a stage where we were told on a Thursday that on the following Monday, Chief of Defence Staff will be appointed. There was a rehearsal carried out at Amar Jawan Jyoti of a Guard of Honor, but that Monday never happened. So we came that close to establishing a Chief of Defence Staff in 2001, 2002, but it didn't happen. However, it did lead to the setting up of the Andaman Nicobar Command as an experiment in theaterization, with its headquarters at Port Blair. This was in many ways an upgradation of the existing structure over there. Prior to the Andaman Nicobar Command, there was a unified command in Port Blair called FOTAN, Fortress Command Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The setting up of the ANC invited criticism from all our maritime neighbors in the east and southeast, who claimed that India, after its Kargil victory, was on a military expansion spree and that they felt threatened by it. This also led to some hesitation on our part in realizing the full potential of the ANC, which many former CNCs of the ANC believe has still not been realized. A lot more could have been achieved in understanding theaterization than has been with the ANC experiment. To assuage the concerns of these countries, there was more or less no increase in the existing force levels, but the organization was restructured into a command headquarters headed by a CNC, in rotation from the three services, with a 2-star chief of staff who would be from the Navy if the CNC was not, and 1-star Army, Navy, and Air Force component commanders. Finally, 18 years later, the CDS was finally approved, and one of its principal mandates was to reorganize the existing operational structures into theater commands. Having outlined the basic structural contours of the MPC, it was initially proposed that a peninsular command would be set up and headquartered at Port Blair, which would be tasked with the security of India's maritime frontiers. But this was later changed to a maritime theater command headquartered at India's new naval base at Karwar. As for the current plan, as I understand it from the last presentation that I heard on this, the existing Eastern and Western naval commanders-in-chief heading their respective commands would continue as before, but would now report to the CNS for readiness and the CNC Maritime Theatre Command for operations. The CNC MPC in turn would be responsible to the CDS as the permanent chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, which would also include the 3 service chiefs. The CNS would no longer be the operational head and would be responsible to raise, train, and sustain. The CNC MPC would be supported by 3-star Army and Air Force component commanders and would include forces from both the Army, the Amphibious Brigade, and perhaps a Jaguar squadron operating from Jamnagar and a Sukhoi element from Trivandrum. This in itself, I'm sure, will present some challenges when really the time comes, because from what I've read, while the CNS will only be responsible for raise, train, and sustain, all air assets will continue to be under the Chief of Air Staff. So he's going to task the Air Force with their tasks. So there are going to be pulls and stretches, particularly if we continue to operate at suboptimal levels of number of squadrons in the Air Force. Whether we'll be able to meet these requirements will have to be seen. But I don't anticipate a problem, because in any case, navies are expected to operate far beyond the shores of the country. So I'm sure the naval component of the Maritime Theatre Command will be able to address most of the major security challenges. Having outlined the basic structural contours of the MPC, let us examine if it addresses India's maritime aspirations. In my view, and this is shared by many, the IAN already operates in 2 distinct theatres. Its eastern seaboard, which includes the Bay of Bengal extending up to the Malacca Straits, and the southeastern Indian Ocean up to Australia, and its western seaboard extending from its west coast up to the western extremity of the Indian Ocean, including the Horn of Africa, the Straits of Hormuz, and the East African coast. Both these theatres are distinct with their own set of security challenges. Both seaboards are equally important for India from an economic perspective, with 45% of our trade from the east and about 55% from the west. However, if one were to view the Indian Ocean as a single theatre, it would give the theatre commander flexibility to deploy and redeploy his forces across the length and breadth of the Indian Ocean, thus optimally exploiting inherent flexibility, agility, and mobility of naval forces to take the offensive to the enemy. To give an example, 80% of China's energy and its trade passes through the Indian Ocean, and then through the narrow choke points connecting the Indian Ocean to the Western Pacific. China considers this a major vulnerability, and it calls it its Malacca dilemma. If this vulnerability could be extended in terms of China having to worry about not only its passage in oil traveling through the Malacca Strait, but about passing south of India through the Western Indian Ocean, this would greatly enhance our favorable maritime situation in that region. And it is this very vulnerability that has now forced China to seek alternate routes through sea land connectivity directly from Gwadar in the Arabian Sea to its mainland via the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and in the Bay of Bengal from the deep water port it has established in Chokfu. This vulnerability is also one of the reasons that it is paying so much attention to the Northern Sea Route via its Polar Silk Road, which not only reduces the transit time from Europe to Shanghai, but also reduces its vulnerability. A determined India could choke Chinese shipping at the Bab el-Mandeb itself, or for that matter, at the Mozambique Channel, thus increasing its vulnerability in the Indian Ocean. And this is also one of the reasons why China is focusing so much on expanding its presence both in West Asia and in the Western Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is one of the busiest waterways in the world, with over 100,000 ships transiting through it annually. and because it provides the vital connectivity between the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Oceans. In the strategic construct of the Indo-Pacific and even multilateral mechanisms like the Quad, India is the only Indian Ocean power, while the others are all resident in the Pacific. Hence, India is more or less singly responsible for ensuring a free and open Indo of the Indo-Pacific and ensuring that a rule-based order across this entire expanse of ocean. The Indian Ocean is itself beset with a wide spectrum of traditional and non-traditional security challenges, be it piracy, maritime terrorism, human narcotic or arms smuggling, or perhaps the gravest of them all, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, or IUU. The vast expanse of this ocean also makes it impossible for any one country to address all of these. India, being fully conscious of this challenge, has endeavored to develop a regional approach to securing the Indian Ocean through its inclusive and cooperative capacity and capability enhancement with countries in its maritime neighborhood. This has been encapsulated in the Sagar policy, which was first enunciated by the Prime Minister during his Sagar is Security and Growth for All in the region. It's an acronym for that, which was first enunciated by the Prime Minister during his trip to Mauritius in 2015. Sagar now underpins almost all maritime security-related activities in the region, including the emphasis on maritime domain awareness and information sharing. Addressing this vast array of security challenges with our limited resources requires a very judicious deployment of our assets, which can be better controlled by a single operational authority than by two operational authorities operating in the same large expanse of the sea. Having highlighted the Indian Navy's stellar performance in securing India's maritime interests and fulfilling its maritime aspirations, I will take the liberty of highlighting that the principal role of navies is not only war fighting, but to win a war. As I mentioned earlier, navies are traditionally offensive by nature and are expected to take the fight to the enemy. The biggest challenge for the Maritime Theatre Command, in my view, will be to get the force he requires to deliver a successful outcome. There are some critical gaps which are creeping into our operational capability, and these are widening due to both inadequate funding and political and bureaucratic indecisiveness. We can discuss this later in the Q&A. India's aspiration is to be a major maritime power, but obviously one can only cut one's coat according to one's cloth. So if India's political leadership wants a bigger maritime coat aligned with our global ambitions, it will have to find the cloth to make it happen. Would a theaterized command structure be able to address these issues that have plagued India's military planners over the years? Both the ongoing conflicts presently have shown that wars, even between grossly asymmetric adversaries, can be long drawn-out affairs. So between equal adversaries, they will be long and costly and with a high degree of attrition on both sides. Hence, any critical gap in a full spectrum conflict could prove very costly. The future maritime space is going to be highly networked, covering a wide sea area with real-time data processing, lethal weaponry, space assets, disruptive and autonomous technologies, long-range maritime surveillance, multi-static sensors, and hypersonic capabilities, to name just a few. All of this will lend themselves to delivering the desired outcomes in a theaterized environment. So we have to be prepared for it. I could go on for a long time on maritime issues, but I will stop over here. Thank you very much for your patience in listening to me.